I woke up screaming his name. Thomas. A name I had never heard before that night. A name that didn't belong to anyone in my life. Not a friend, not a relative, not a character from a book I had read or a movie I had watched. And yet, as the echo of my own voice faded into the darkness of my bedroom, I felt something shatter inside my chest. A grief so raw, so absolute, so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe. My lungs refused to work. My heart felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand. I was 26 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm, and I had just watched a man I had never met die in my dreams. I watched him fall. I watched the snow turn red beneath him. I watched the life leave his body as searchlight swept across the frozen ground. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me to my core, that I had been there, that I had seen it happen, that the woman screaming on the other side of that wall, the woman pressing her face against a frozen window, watching helplessly as everything she loved was destroyed, was me. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 3 years, I have been trying to understand the memories that don't belong to this life. Memories of a city divided by concrete and barbed wire and ideology. Memories of a love that transcended everything. Politics, borders, the threat of death itself. Memories of a man named Thomas Richter, who died trying to reach me on a frozen December night in 1962, in the shadow of the Berlin Wall. This is our story. The story of how we found each other across time and space, how we were torn apart by history's cruelest division, and how 60 years later I finally understand why I've spent my entire life feeling like half of my soul was missing. It started when I was a child. I must have been 4 or 5 years old when I first drew the wall. My mother found me in the living room of our small house in Portland, crayons scattered around me in a colorful explosion, working on what she thought was a picture of a house. But it wasn't a house. It was a wall. A long, gray wall stretching across the entire page, with a tall tower in the corner. And on one side of the wall I had drawn a girl with yellow hair and a blue dress, tears streaming down her face. On the other side, a boy with brown hair and a green jacket, his arms stretched out, reaching for her, but unable to touch her. My mother asked me what I was drawing, and I said, and she swears to this day, with tears in her eyes, that these were my exact words. That's where Thomas can't find me anymore. She laughed it off at the time. Children say strange things. They have imaginary friends and make up elaborate stories and create entire worlds in their heads. But she kept the drawing. She kept it because something in my voice that day made her deeply uncomfortable. Something in the way I said his name, like I was remembering someone real, someone I had lost, someone whose absence caused me physical pain. She told me about it years later, after everything else started happening, after the dreams and the visions and the memories that couldn't possibly be mine. And she showed me the drawing, yellowed with age, still carefully preserved in a box of my childhood things. I looked at it and felt my hands go cold. Because even at 4 years old, living in the Pacific Northwest, having never seen the Berlin Wall or learned about it in school, I had drawn the watchtower exactly right. I had drawn the death strip, the open space between the two parallel walls where guards would shoot anyone who tried to cross. I had drawn the anti-vehicle trenches and the signal fences and the raked sand that would show footprints. I had drawn details that a child in Oregon in 1994 could not possibly have known. But the drawings were just the beginning. As I grew older, I started having what I can only describe as intrusions. Moments where I would smell something, hear something, taste something, and suddenly I wasn't in my own life anymore. I was somewhere else. Someone else. The first time it happened that I really remember it clearly, I was 12 years old. We were at a Christmas market in Seattle. My parents had taken me as a special treat, a family tradition we had started a few years before, and I was standing in front of a stall that sold hand-carved wooden ornaments. The vendor was an elderly German man who spoke with a thick accent, and there was music playing from speakers nearby, old German Christmas carols that I had never heard before. The smell of mulled wine and roasted almonds and gingerbread was everywhere, and the lights sparkled on the fresh snow, and everyone was laughing, happy, filled with holiday spirit. And then, without warning, I wasn't in Seattle anymore. I was standing in a cobblestone square. It was nighttime, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation like swallowing tiny knives. There were lights strung between the buildings, golden and warm, and people were everywhere, talking and laughing in German, and I could understand them. Every word, every joke, every casual comment about the weather, or the prices, or the quality of this year's Christmas cookies. I could understand them as easily as I understood English, even though I had never studied German, never even heard it spoken outside of war movies on television. A woman walked past me carrying a brown paper bag, and I could smell ginger and cinnamon, could see the powdered sugar dusted on her coat sleeve. And then I heard his voice. A voice I knew, a voice I had known forever, a voice that made my heart leap and my stomach flip and my whole body come alive with recognition. He was calling out, "Elsa! Elsa, I found the one you wanted. The gold star, see? It's perfect!" I turned around, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I saw him. Tall, taller than most of the people around him, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that made me want to brush it back with my fingers. And his eyes, God, his eyes, they were the most impossible shade of green, like spring leaves in sunlight, like the color of hope itself. He was holding up a wooden star, painted gold, with tiny silver accents, grinning at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Like the entire universe existed just for the two of us. In that moment, in that square, surrounded by strangers who didn't know they were witnessing something miraculous. And I felt, I can't describe this properly. I've never been able to find the right words. I felt whole. Like every piece of me that had ever been scattered. Every fragment of my soul that had felt lost and disconnected and incomplete suddenly came together. Like I had found something I didn't even know I had lost. Like I had finally come home, and then my mother's hand was on my shoulder, shaking me, and I was back in Seattle, and I was crying, sobbing so hard I couldn't stand up, couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. My mother thought I was having some kind of seizure. Some medical emergency. She took me to the hospital emergency room, held my hand while they ran tests, answered questions from doctors who looked at us with barely concealed skepticism. Everything came back normal. Brain scans, blood work, neurological exams, all perfectly fine. The doctor said it was probably a panic attack, maybe triggered by the crowds and noise and sensory overload of the Christmas market. They prescribed me medication I never took and recommended therapy I never attended. Because how could I explain to a therapist that I wasn't panicking, that I was grieving, that I had just seen the love of my life and then watched him disappear? How could I explain that I was mourning someone I had never met, someone whose name I didn't even know? That was the first time I saw Thomas. But it wouldn't be the last. Not by a long shot. The memories started coming more frequently after that Christmas market experience. Like a dam had broken somewhere inside me, and now everything was flooding through. Sometimes they were small things. A flash of a street corner I had never visited. The sound of a church bell I had never heard. The taste of a food I had never eaten but somehow recognized. The smell of cheap industrial soap that made my chest ache with longing. Other times they were longer. More immersive, more complete. I would lose minutes, sometimes hours, to what I can only call visions. I would be sitting in class, or eating dinner with my family, or lying in bed trying to sleep, and suddenly I would be somewhere else, someone else, living moments that didn't belong to me. My parents took me to doctors, specialists, psychiatrists, therapists, anyone who might have an answer. Everyone had a theory. Temporal lobe epilepsy that didn't show up on scans. Dissociative episodes triggered by childhood trauma that no one could identify. An overactive imagination paired with a talent for historical research that I was somehow conducting unconsciously. No one had a real answer. No one could explain why I knew things I shouldn't know, remembered places I had never been, loved a man I had never met with an intensity that made all my real-life relationships feel like shadows, like pale imitations of what love was supposed to be. By the time I was 16, I had pieced together fragments of another life from the visions and dreams and intrusions that had become my constant companions. I knew that her name was Elsa. Elsa Hoffman. I knew she lived in East Berlin, in a small apartment on the third floor of a gray building near the Friedrichstrasse station. The apartment had water stains on the ceiling, and a window that didn't close properly, and a radiator that clanked like a dying animal in the winter. I knew she worked in a factory that made light bulbs, standing at a conveyor belt for 10 hours a day, and that she hated the smell of hot glass that clung to her clothes and her hair no matter how many times she washed them. I knew she had a younger brother named Peter, who was always getting into trouble with his big mouth and his bigger ideas, who asked questions that made their mother's face go pale with fear. I knew she had a mother who worried constantly about things she never spoke aloud, who jumped at every knock on the door, who had learned under the Nazis and then the Soviets that silence was the only way to survive. And I knew about Thomas. Thomas Richter was from West Berlin. He was a medical student at the Free University, though I'm not sure exactly how far along he was in his studies. 3rd year, maybe 4th. He wanted to be a surgeon. He had steady hands that never trembled, even when he was nervous, and a patient temperament that could calm the most frightened patient, and he believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that he could save people. That medicine was his calling, his purpose, his way of making the world a little bit better than he had found it. He came from a family that had lost everything in the war, had rebuilt themselves from nothing, and he was going to be the first doctor in his family, the proof that their sacrifices had meant something. He and Elsa had met at a dance in the summer of 1959, before the wall existed, when you could still cross between East and West Berlin with nothing more than a tram ticket and a bit of courage and the willingness to endure suspicious looks from the border guards. Thomas had asked Elsa to dance, crossing the room with a confidence that made her heart skip and her defenses rise simultaneously. She had said no. She had said no because he was too handsome, too self-assured, too Western, with his clean clothes and his easy smile, and she was certain he was making fun of her, playing some kind of joke on the factory girl from the East. But Thomas hadn't given up. He had found her after the dance, waiting alone at a tram stop while rain poured down in sheets, and he had offered her his umbrella. Just held it out to her, getting soaked himself, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You'll get sick," she had said, confused by his persistence, by the genuine warmth in his eyes. "Worth it," he had replied, smiling that devastating smile. "Getting to talk to you is worth it." And that was it. That was the beginning of everything. That was the moment that would lead to everything that came after. The love, the hope, the wall, the death, the grief that would span decades and lifetimes. I know this because I lived it. Because somewhere inside me, Elsa is still there, still remembering, still loving him with an intensity that time and death and reincarnation have not diminished one single bit. When I close my eyes, I can feel his hand in mine, large and warm and impossibly gentle. I can smell the soap he used, something plain and medicinal, because that's all he could afford on a student's budget. I can hear his laugh, low and warm and surprised, the kind of laugh that made everything seem possible, like happiness wasn't just a concept, but something you could actually reach out and touch. They had 2 years together before the wall. 2 years of stolen afternoons and secret meetings and letters passed through trusted friends. 2 years of being young and desperately in love and believing that nothing, not politics, not ideology, not the vast machinery of governments and armies, could ever tear them apart. And then, on August 13th, 1961, they built the wall. I don't remember exactly where Elsa was when she heard the news. The memories of that day are fragmented, shattered, like trying to watch a film that keeps skipping and jumping. I think I think she was at work when it started. I have this image, this fragment, of standing on a factory floor, surrounded by other women, all of them frozen in place, some of them crying. Someone had brought a radio, smuggled it in despite the rules, and the static-filled voice was saying something about border closures, about protection from Western aggression, about necessary measures to preserve the socialist state. Words that meant nothing. Words that meant everything. And Elsa wasn't crying like the others. She was frozen, paralyzed, her mind racing through the implications. She was thinking about Thomas, about the fact that he was on the other side of an invisible line that had suddenly become a wall. She was supposed to meet him that night at their usual place, a small cafe near the Brandenburg Gate, where the owner pretended not to notice young lovers from different sectors holding hands under the table. And now there was no way to get there. Now there might never be a way to get there again. I remember the first time I saw the wall in person, not through Elsa's eyes, through my own, Sarah's own, in this lifetime. I was 23 years old, and I had finally saved enough money from my graphic design job to go to Berlin. I told my parents I was going to Europe for vacation, which was technically true. I wanted to see Paris, Amsterdam, Rome. But mostly I wanted to go to Berlin. I needed to go to Berlin. I needed to see the place that haunted my dreams, needed to walk the streets I remembered, needed to find evidence that any of this was real. I didn't tell my parents that I was going to look for a dead man. I didn't tell them that I had spent years researching, collecting information, piecing together fragments from history books and academic papers and obscure archives. I didn't tell them about the folders on my computer, filled with everything I could find about the Berlin Wall, about escape attempts, about the people who had died trying to cross from east to west. I didn't tell them about the list of names I had compiled, hoping to find Thomas among them. I didn't tell them that I was terrified of what I might find, and equally terrified of finding nothing at all. And they had existed. That was the thing that changed everything. When I got to Berlin, when I walked out of the airport and felt the city wrap around me like a familiar embrace, I knew I was in the right place. The architecture had changed. The wall was mostly gone except for memorial sections. But something in my soul recognized this place. This was home, not Portland, not Seattle, not anywhere I had lived in this lifetime. This gray, sprawling, history-soaked city was where I belonged. I went to the archives first, the Stasi records office, now open to the public, where you could request access to files about ordinary citizens who had been monitored by the secret police. I went to memorial sites, the Berlin Wall Memorial on Bernauer Strasse, where a preserved section of the wall still stands as a reminder of what once was. I went to the places where people who remembered the wall gathered to tell their stories, support groups and historical societies, and informal gatherings at coffee shops and community centers. And I found them. I found records of an Elsa Hoffman, born June 3, 1940, in Berlin, who had worked at the Narva light bulb factory in East Berlin from 1958 until 1983, who had lived at the address I remembered, the building with the water stains and the clanking radiator. I found records of her mother, Margaret Hoffman, deceased 1970. Her brother Peter, who had been arrested in 1965 for distributing subversive materials and spent 3 years in prison before being quietly released. I found a photograph, a single grainy black and white photograph from a factory newsletter, some kind of propaganda piece about the happy workers of the socialist paradise, and when I saw her face, I started crying so hard that the archivist hurried over to ask if I was okay. Because it was my face. Not exactly, not precisely. Her nose was slightly different, her chin a little sharper, but close enough to be terrifying. The same eyes, the same shape of the jaw, the same expression, like she was always waiting for something just out of reach. Like she was looking at the camera but seeing something else entirely, something far away, something lost. Finding Thomas was harder. West Berlin records were different, scattered across multiple archives, some lost, some destroyed, some still classified for reasons no one could explain. But I found him too, eventually, after weeks of searching, after following dead ends and false leads and trails that went nowhere. Thomas Richter, born March 15, 1938, in Berlin. Medical student at the Free University of Berlin, enrolled 1957. There was a photograph of him in a university publication from 1960, a group shot of students in white coats, and I had to sit down when I saw it. I had to put my head between my knees and remember how to breathe. Because it was him, the man from the Christmas market vision, the man whose name I had screamed in my sleep, the man with the green eyes and the falling dark hair and the smile that made everything seem possible, the man I had loved for as long as I could remember, even before I understood what love meant, even before I knew his name. But here's the thing about archival research. It can only take you so far. I could find records of their births, their jobs, their official documents, stamped and filed by bureaucrats who had no idea they were documenting a love story. But I couldn't find records of their love. I couldn't find evidence of the letters they wrote, the meetings they risked everything for, the plans they made and remade and made again. That part existed only in my memories, in the fragments that came to me in dreams and visions, piecing themselves together like a puzzle I was never meant to solve but couldn't stop trying to complete. Let me tell you about those 2 years before the wall. Let me tell you what I remember of their love, even if the details are sometimes blurred, sometimes incomplete, sometimes filtered through decades and lifetimes and the imperfect lens of memory. They had a routine. Thomas and Elsa. Every Sunday, without fail, Thomas would take the S-Bahn across the sector border. It was still possible then, still legal, though everyone knew the East German authorities were watching, taking notes, making lists of who went where and who met whom. He would meet Elsa at a small park near her apartment building. It wasn't much of a park, really. Just a patch of grass with a few scraggly trees and a wooden bench that had seen better days, its paint peeling and its slats warped by years of rain and snow. But it was theirs. They called it their garden, a joke between them, even though nothing grew there but weeds and dandelions. They would sit on that bench and talk for hours about everything and nothing. About his studies, about her work, about books they had read and films they wanted to see and all the places they would visit someday, when things were different, when they could be together properly. Thomas wanted to take Elsa to the West. He talked about it constantly, his plans growing more elaborate and more detailed with each visit. He would finish his medical degree, only 2 more years, maybe 3. He would get a job at a hospital, work hard, prove himself. They would get a small apartment, nothing fancy, maybe in Charlottenburg or Schöneberg, somewhere quiet with trees and good neighbors. They would have a cat. Elsa loved cats, had always loved them, though she had never been allowed to have one in the cramped apartment she shared with her mother and brother. And maybe, eventually, a family. A little girl, Thomas always said, with Elsa's eyes and his stubbornness. They would name her Marie, after his grandmother, who had died during the war but who Thomas remembered as the kindest person he had ever known. And they would be happy. They would be so impossibly, improbably, ridiculously happy. But Elsa couldn't leave. Not then, not yet. Her mother was sick. I think it was her heart, though the memories aren't entirely clear. The medical details fuzzy the way dreams are fuzzy, and she was getting worse. Peter was too young, only 15 or 16, and already attracting attention from the authorities for his inability to keep his mouth shut, his habit of asking questions that made teachers uncomfortable and neighbors nervous. If Elsa left, if she abandoned them and fled to the West, what would happen to them? She couldn't take them with her. The logistics were impossible, and her mother was too frail for the stress of an illegal border crossing. But she couldn't leave them behind either, couldn't abandon them to face whatever consequences might come. So she stayed, and she waited, and she told Thomas to be patient. Soon, she would say, holding his hand on their bench in their garden that wasn't really a garden. Things will change soon. They have to. Nothing this cruel can last forever. Things changed, but not in the way either of them hoped. I remember the last time they saw each other before the wall went up. It was a Saturday evening in early August 1961, the air thick with summer heat, and the smell of exhaust and something else, something electric, like the atmosphere before a storm. Thomas had come to the park, as always, but there was something different about him that day. Something urgent in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way his eyes kept darting to the street like he expected someone to appear at any moment. He had heard rumors. Everyone had heard rumors. Whispers passed from friend to friend. Warnings from relatives with connections. Things were happening. Something big. Border crossings were being monitored more closely than ever. There was talk of closures, restrictions, something unprecedented. He begged Elsa to come with him. Right then, right there, that very night. Leave everything behind. Her mother, her brother, her job, her entire life, and just come. They could figure out the rest later. They could send money back, find a way to help her family from the other side. But she had to come now, before it was too late, before whatever was about to happen happened. And she almost did. God, she almost did. I can feel it even now, 60 years and a lifetime later. The pull of it, the desperate wanting, the war between love and duty that tore her apart. She looked at Thomas, at his beautiful face, at the fear in his green eyes, and she almost said yes. The word was on her lips. Her hand was in his. One step, that's all it would have taken. One step toward him, toward their future, toward everything they had dreamed about. But then she thought about her mother, lying in bed in their cramped apartment, coughing and struggling to breathe. And Peter, who was probably out somewhere right now, getting into trouble, saying things that would end up in a Stasi file somewhere. And she couldn't abandon them. Not like that. Not without saying goodbye, without making arrangements, without knowing they would be okay. 1 week, she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Give me 1 week. I'll talk to them, I'll figure something out, I'll find a way. And then I'll come. I promise you, Thomas, I swear it. 1 week. He didn't want to leave. He stood there in their garden, holding her hand so tightly it almost hurt, and she could see in his eyes that he knew. He knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. But what could he do? Drag her across the border against her will? Force her to abandon her family? He wasn't that kind of man. He had never been that kind of man. So he kissed her, long and desperate, and full of all the things they couldn't say, and he made her promise again. 1 week, he repeated. I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting. 1 week later, at 2 a.m. on August 13th, 1961, they built the wall. The memories of that day are fractured, impossible to hold on to, like trying to catch water in my hands. I get flashes. The crackle of the radio announcing the border closure, her mother's face gone gray with shock, Peter coming home with wild eyes saying the streets were full of soldiers, the sound of tanks in the distance, the sight of barbed wire being strung across roads that had been open just hours before, people running, crying, screaming, families torn apart in the middle of the night, lovers separated by a line drawn by men in suits who had never met them and never would. I don't know if Elsa tried to cross that day. I think she did. I have fragments, flashes, running through streets she knew by heart, pushing through crowds, seeing the wire and the soldiers and understanding, finally, horribly, that this was real, that the world had changed overnight, that everything she had been promised, everything she had planned for, everything she had dreamed of, was now on the other side of a barrier she couldn't cross. But Elsa didn't give up on Thomas. The wall went up, and she didn't give up. She couldn't see him anymore, couldn't reach him, couldn't even write to him without risking arrest. But she didn't stop loving him. She never stopped loving him, not for one single day. They found ways to communicate, at first. There were networks, underground connections, people who would carry messages across the border for the right price or the right ideology. Thomas sent letters through these intermediaries, brief notes on thin paper that Elsa would read by candlelight in her room, memorizing every word before burning the paper in her tiny kitchen stove. He was still waiting, he wrote. He was still planning. There were people who could help. Engineers and students and activists who believed the wall was an abomination, who who were digging tunnels and devising escape routes and refusing to accept that this division was permanent. He would find a way to bring her across. He would never stop trying. He loved her. He would always love her. She was the only thing that mattered. But the months passed, and the wall grew stronger, higher, more fortified. The death strip widened. The watchtowers multiplied. The guards were given orders to shoot to kill, and they followed those orders with terrifying efficiency. People who tried to escape were shot down like animals, their bodies left in the open as warnings to anyone else who might be tempted to try. The underground networks were discovered, their members arrested, interrogated, imprisoned, sometimes executed. The letters became less frequent, harder to deliver, more dangerous to send or receive, and Elsa began to feel something she had never felt before: despair. I remember one night, and I know this is Elsa's memory, not mine, because I can taste the salt of tears on my lips, feel the cold of window glass against my forehead, when she stood in her small apartment, looking out at the wall. It was winter, late 1961 or maybe early 1962, and snow was falling, covering everything in white, softening the harsh angles of the concrete and wire. The wall looked almost beautiful in the snow, which was the cruelest thing of all. And she thought about Thomas on the other side, so close, barely a mile away, maybe less, and so impossibly, permanently far. She wondered if she would ever see him again. She wondered if it was fair to keep him waiting, to keep him hoping, to keep him tied to a ghost of a future that might never come. She thought about writing to him one last time, telling him to move on, to find someone else, to live the life they had dreamed about with another woman who could actually be there, a woman who could hold his hand and sleep beside him and give him the family he deserved. It would be the kind thing to do, the selfless thing, the right thing. But she couldn't. She was too selfish, too desperate. She loved him too much to let him go, even when letting him go was the only loving thing to do. And as it turned out, Thomas was even more stubborn than she was. In the spring of 1962, Thomas made contact with a group that was planning an escape tunnel. I've researched this extensively in this lifetime, trying to verify what I remember, and there were indeed several tunnels dug under the wall in those early years. The most famous ones, Tunnel 29, Tunnel 57, came later, but there were earlier attempts, some successful, most not. Thomas found a group of students and activists who were digging a tunnel from a basement in West Berlin, under the wall and the death strip, to a building in the east. It would take months to complete. It was dangerous, back-breaking work, digging through clay and rock and groundwater, shoring up walls that wanted to collapse, working in near-total darkness with the constant fear of discovery. But when it was done, when they finally broke through, Elsa would be waiting on the other side. They would finally be together. He sent word to her through the last remaining link they had, a woman who worked as a cleaner in a government building that straddled the sector boundary. June, the message said. Be ready in June. There will be a way. Elsa waited. She counted the days on a calendar she kept hidden under her mattress, crossing them off one by one, not daring to hope too much, but unable to stop hoping entirely. She didn't tell her mother or Peter. It was too dangerous. The fewer people who knew, the better. And besides, her mother's health had worsened significantly. She wasn't sure her mother could survive the stress of an escape attempt, let alone the physical demands of crawling through a narrow tunnel for hundreds of meters. So she waited alone with her secret, trying not to let the hope show on her face, trying not to give anything away. June came and went. Something had gone wrong with the tunnel. The authorities had discovered it. Or maybe the engineering had failed, the ground too wet, the tunnel collapsing. Elsa never found out the exact details. All she knew was that the woman who carried messages stopped coming. There was only silence from the other side of the wall. Silence that stretched for days, then weeks, then months. She thought Thomas had given up. She thought, this is so hard to say, even now, even knowing the truth. She thought maybe he had finally listened to reason. Maybe he had realized that she wasn't worth dying for. Maybe he had found someone else, someone he could actually be with, someone who wouldn't cost him everything. It would have been the smart thing to do. It would have been what she had wanted for him, what she had almost asked for. But Thomas hadn't given up. Thomas was incapable of giving up when it came to Elsa. In December 1962, he tried to cross the wall himself. I need to pause here. I need to tell you what I know about that night, December 17th, 1962, because it's the night that has defined my existence across 2 lifetimes. It's the night that woke me up screaming at 26 years old. It's the night I dream about still, more than 60 years after it happened, more than 30 years before I was even born. I have pieced this together from many sources. Some of it comes from Elsa's memories. What she saw, what she heard, what she felt standing at that window. Some of it comes from historical research, from accounts of similar escape attempts, from the documented physics of walls and watchtowers and guards with shoot-to-kill orders. And some of it, I believe, comes from Thomas himself, from some connection that still exists between us, across time, across death, across the vast mystery of whatever it is that makes consciousness continuous from one life to the next. It was a Tuesday, December 17th, 1962. The weather had been brutal for weeks. Snow and ice and temperatures so far below freezing that pipes burst and cars wouldn't start, and people died in their beds if they couldn't afford enough fuel for their stoves. The cold made escape attempts both easier and harder. Easier because the guards were less vigilant, huddled in their watchtowers with space heaters, reluctant to patrol the death strip in weather that could kill in minutes. Harder because the cold itself was a killer, because wet clothes would freeze solid in seconds, because a single misstep on ice could mean a broken ankle that would make escape impossible. Thomas had found another group, not tunnelers this time. There wasn't time for tunnels, and too many had been discovered. These were people who had studied the wall, mapped its weaknesses, timed the guard rotations down to the second. They knew of a section near Bernauer Strasse where the death strip was narrower than usual, where a building on the east side had a window that overlooked the wall at exactly the right angle. If you could get to that window, if you could make the jump at exactly the right moment, you might be able to clear the first barrier and make it to the west before the guards in the nearest watchtower could react. You would have maybe 30 seconds. Maybe less. It was a suicide mission. Everyone involved knew it. The odds of success were vanishingly small. But Thomas went anyway. He went because 6 months of silence had been more than he could bear. He went because he had tried everything else and failed. He went because living without Elsa wasn't really living at all. He had sent one last message to her through a friend of a friend of a friend, a chain of whispered words that could have gotten any one of them arrested. "Be at the window," the message said. "3rd floor, corner of Bernauer and Schwederstrasse. Midnight on December 17th. I'm coming for you. One way or another, I'm coming." Elsa got the message. She went. She remembers. I remember. Standing in that dark apartment. It had been abandoned for months, its residents fled, or arrested, or simply vanished, and it smelled of mold and decay and broken dreams. The cold was absolute, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your teeth ache. She pressed her face against the window glass, which was so cold it burned, and strained to see anything through the falling snow. The death strip below was a white expanse, broken only by the dark lines of the anti-vehicle trenches and the stark silhouettes of the watchtowers. She watched the clock on a distant church tower strike midnight, 12 chimes, each one feeling like a year. And then she saw him. He had made it over the first wall somehow, a ladder, a rope, something, I don't know exactly how, and he was running. Running across the death strip, a dark figure against the white snow, his legs pumping, his arms swinging, his whole body bent forward with desperate momentum. He was so close. So impossibly, miraculously close. Maybe 50 meters from the second wall. Maybe less. Elsa could see his face, could see the desperate hope in his eyes as he looked up at the window, looked up at her, and her heart was exploding in her chest. and she was crying and laughing and pressing her hands against the glass like she could reach through it to him. The shot came from the watchtower to the south. Thomas fell. I cannot describe what Elsa felt in that moment. There are no words in any language I know. There is only the sensation of being torn in half, of having something vital ripped from your chest, of screaming without sound because the grief is too enormous to fit in any human throat. She watched him fall, watched him lie still in the snow, watched the white turn red beneath him in a spreading pool. And she couldn't go to him. She couldn't hold him. She couldn't even call his name, because the guards were shouting, searchlights were sweeping the area, and she would be shot too if she moved, if she made any sound, if she gave any sign that she was there. She stood at that window until dawn. She watched the snow continue to fall, slowly covering his body, gently, tenderly, like the world was trying to bury what had happened. She watched the sky turn gray, then pink, then pale winter blue, and when the sun came up and the guards finally retrieved his body, dragging him away carelessly, like he was nothing, like he was garbage, like he hadn't been someone's son and someone's friend and someone's love, she felt something inside her break, something that would never heal, something that would stay broken for the rest of that life and carry over into this one. Elsa Hoffman lived for another 31 years after that night. She died in 1993, just a few years after the wall finally came down, before she ever got to walk freely through the Brandenburg Gate. She never married. She never had children. She never loved anyone else. Not the way she had loved Thomas. She existed, but she wasn't really alive. Part of her had died in that death strip, in the snow, alongside the man who had tried to reach her. And then, on April 12th, 1997, a baby girl was born in Portland, Oregon, a girl who would draw walls before she could write, a girl who would scream a dead man's name in her sleep, a girl who would spend her entire life feeling like half of her soul was missing, like she was waiting for someone who would never come. Me. I don't understand why this happens. I've spent years trying to understand, reading everything I can find about reincarnation and past life memories, and the science and pseudoscience of consciousness. I've talked to researchers, to spiritual leaders, to skeptics who think I'm delusional, and believers who think I'm proof of something profound. I still don't have answers. I don't know why some people remember past lives and others don't. I don't know why I was Elsa Hoffman, or why I'm Sarah Mitchell now, or what any of it means in the grand scheme of things. But I know this: the love was real. Whatever else might be illusion, whatever else might be explained away by neuroscience or psychology or the human brain's remarkable capacity for creating false memories, the love was real. Elsa loved Thomas with everything she was. Thomas loved Elsa enough to die for her. And somehow, across 60 years and an ocean and whatever vast mystery separates one life from the next, that love survived. I went back to Berlin last December. It was the 60th anniversary of Thomas's death, and I felt pulled there, drawn by something I couldn't resist. I went to Bernauer Strasse, to the memorial that now stands where the wall used to be. Preserved sections of the wall rise from carefully maintained grass, photographs of the dead line, a steel walkway. There's a chapel, a documentation center, a monument to everyone who died trying to cross. I found the place where I believe, where I know, he fell. There's a small marker there now, one of many, commemorating the unnamed and forgotten. I stood in the December cold, snow falling just as it had fallen that night, and I told him I was sorry. I told him that I had waited. I told him that I had tried to reach him in this life and the last one, and I was sorry it was never enough. I told him that I had found him, all these years later, all these lives later, and I would never, ever forget him. I don't know if he heard me. I don't know if there's anything left of Thomas Richter to hear, but as I stood there in the falling snow, I felt something, a warmth beside me, just for a moment, a presence, gentle and familiar, Like someone was standing next to me. Like someone was finally saying goodbye. I'm 32 years old now. I have a life here in Portland. A job I love, friends who have learned to accept my strange stories. A cat named Marie that I got because of a promise made in another lifetime. I go to therapy now, finally. I've accepted that what happened to me is real, even if I can't prove it, even if most people don't believe me. I've learned to carry Elsa's memories alongside my own, to let her grief exist without letting it consume me completely. Most days, I'm okay. Most days, I can look at photos of the wall without breaking down. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I still think about what might have been. What if Elsa had said yes that Saturday in August? What if she had crossed the border before the wall went up? What if Thomas's tunnel had succeeded? Or his escape attempt had come a few seconds sooner? Or the guard had hesitated, had remembered his own humanity, had shown mercy to a young man who just wanted to be with the woman he loved? There are no answers to these questions. There is only what happened and what we carry with us and what we choose to do with the time we have left. After my last trip to Berlin, I made a decision. I decided to tell this story. Not because I expect anyone to believe me. I've long since stopped worrying about that. But because I think Elsa and Thomas deserve to be remembered. They weren't famous. They didn't change the world. They didn't lead revolutions or write symphonies or discover cures for diseases. They were just two ordinary people who fell in love in a city that was about to be divided, who were destroyed by forces so much larger than themselves that their individual tragedy barely registered as a footnote in history. But their love was real. Their pain was real. And I think that deserves to mean something. And maybe, if I'm honest, I'm also telling this story because I hope he's out there somewhere, not Thomas. I know Thomas is gone. I watched him die. I felt him leave. But what if he came back, the way I came back? What if there's a man out there right now, living his life, not understanding why he dreams of walls and snow and a woman with yellow hair? What if he's searching for me the way I spent so many years searching for him? It's a foolish hope, I know that. But I've built my whole life on foolish hopes, on the stubborn belief that love transcends death, that souls find each other across lifetimes, that the universe is not as cold and random and meaningless as it sometimes seems. Maybe that's naive. Maybe I'm just a woman with a brain that works differently, processing trauma in the form of elaborate fantasies. Maybe none of this is real, but when I close my eyes, I can still feel his hand in mine. I can still hear his voice saying my name. Not Sarah, never Sarah in those moments, always Elsa, always the name that was mine before this body. And I choose to believe that means something. I choose to believe that we will find each other again. So this is my story. This is the story of Elsa and Thomas, of a love that defied borders and ideology and death itself. This is the story of the wall that separated them and the memories that brought them back together. This is the story of a girl in Portland who drew watchtowers before she could write and screamed a dead man's name before she knew what death meant. I don't know how it ends. I don't know if there's a happy ending waiting somewhere, in some other life, in some other version of this strange and beautiful existence. I don't know if Thomas is out there looking for me, or if I'll have to wait until I die and hope we find each other wherever souls go next. But I know I will never stop looking. I will never stop believing. I will never forget the man who died in the snow trying to reach me. And if you're watching this, if you've ever dreamed of walls and winter and a love you can't explain, if you've ever woken up crying for someone you've never met, then maybe you understand. Maybe you're one of us, carrying memories that don't belong to this life, loving people you haven't met yet, searching for something you can't quite name. If you are, I hope you find them. I hope you find each other. I hope the universe is kinder to you than it was to us. And if you see a man with dark hair and impossible green eyes, a man who speaks of medicine and healing and saving people, a man who looks at you like you're the only person in the world who matters, tell him Elsa is still waiting. Tell him I never stopped. Tell him I'll see him on the other side of the wall.